Good afternoon. My name is Ryann Craig. I serve in the Office of Mission and Ministry here at Georgetown University. On behalf of the President's Office and the Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs, welcome to the opening conversation of the 22nd Building Bridges Seminar, Believers and Our Ethics in the Public Square, Christian and Muslim Perspectives. We are delighted to host this afternoon's lectures. Georgetown's Catholic and Jesuit heritage calls us to make a home for all faith traditions, and one of our core values as a community is to promote interreligious understanding. Guided by the Office of Mission and Ministry, we seek engagement that opens up our understanding of God, recognizing and celebrating the spiritual and moral values found among different religious traditions. I think you'll see this afternoon that the Building Bridges initiative exemplifies the best that Georgetown has to offer in this regard. Since 2002, the Building Bridges Seminar, initiated by the Archbishop of Canterbury, has brought together a range of internationally recognized Christian and Muslim scholars for intensive study and exploration of some of the most significant themes that our traditions have in common. A few years back, as a doctoral student at Catholic University, just up the street, in Christian Arabic and Syriac, I regularly benefited from the contributions of Building Bridges scholars, and I continue to promote the publications produced by the seminars, all of which are available to download from the Berkley Center's website, in classes that I teach here at Georgetown. In 2012, before retiring as Archbishop of Canterbury, Dr. Rowan Williams asked President Jack DeGioia whether Georgetown might consider stewarding the Building Bridges Seminar into the future. Dr. DeGioia, who had been a stalwart supporter, host, and sometimes member of the seminar since 2004, generously agreed to take upon this added responsibility and has always valued the Building Bridges initiative as an expression of Georgetown's vision and commitment to global engagement and interreligious understanding. Our thoughts and prayers are with Jack as he continues to recover from a stroke he suffered earlier this month. Finally, let me call on the chair of the seminar, Father Daniel Madigan from the Society of Jesus, who will introduce the seminar's theme and our esteemed presenters. Father Madigan is the Matteo Ricci Professor of Interreligious Theology at Australian Catholic University and Rector of Newman College at the University of Melbourne. Now emeritus at Georgetown, Father Madigan served as the Rouge Family Associate Professor in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies from 2008 to 2021 and is a leading Christian scholar of Islam. He continues as a faculty fellow at the Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs. We are very grateful for his leadership as chair of the Building Bridges Seminar since 2013, especially when it brings him back to the hilltop. I'd like to welcome Dan to the podium.
Good afternoon and welcome all, both members of the Building Bridges Seminar and those of you who are coming to participate in the beginnings of this year's seminar. The topic, as you know from the pieces of paper you have in front of you, is Believers and Our Ethics in the Public Square. And if you came hoping that you would have the whole topic covered and all done and a drink under your belt by 6:30, you're sadly mistaken. What we do at the beginning of each Building Bridges seminar is to map out the territory. We have a lecture from a Muslim scholar, a lecture from a Christian scholar to map out the territory that we will be traversing in our small group conversations during the week. We will flee Washington, D.C. for the beauties of Northern Virginia, and there for 4 days we will study scriptural texts and other traditional texts of our two traditions and grapple with the questions of our ethics in the public square. In Berlin last year, when we were considering what we might discuss this coming year, the question of Israel and Palestine was not on anyone's radar Well, perhaps some people, but it was not on the public radar. And so the question that we are addressing this year happens, I think, to coincide very well with the great need that we have in this particular political and historical situation to look at the question of our ethics, to look at the way we speak about truth and justice, about peace, and so on in the public square. Any discussion of ethics, especially on the part of believers, usually elicits a frisson, not of interest, but perhaps of boredom. People don't want to hear believers talking yet again about what everyone is supposed to be doing, because we as believers begin by acknowledging that for all the do's and don'ts, for all the recommendations and prohibitions that we have in our traditions, we have not succeeded in creating a just society. Indeed, Muslims and Christians are engaged together in some of the largest problematical issues in our world. We're engaged together in a world financial system which excludes so many. We're engaged together in the arms trade. We're engaged together in fossil fuels. We're engaged together in so many things. No one should listen to believers speaking about ethics unless we begin with a mea culpa. And we do that today. We acknowledge that this is not a moment for pride. This is not a moment in which believers can stand and look at the public square and say, we have the wisdom, just listen to us. In our time, what most believers were once convinced were perennial ethical and legal consensuses have been rapidly dissolving, to the delight and relief of some and to the horror of others. This fraying of norms, particularly around sexuality and gender, procreation and death, human rights and freedoms, is often portrayed from outside our communities as the liberation of persons and societies from sacralized taboos imposed by gods no longer believed in. Such voices are rarely taken seriously by believers. But our reactions to this situation of dissolution of consensus, our reaction as believers is quite varied. And we haven't really found a satisfactory way in which to respond to the criticisms that are justly made. That is to say, we struggle to make our ethical voice heard in the public square in a way that is constructive rather than merely assertive or even authoritarian. Our interventions often lack an honest, self-critical insight that might lead us to be more tentative in our pronouncements, as witnessed, for example, the Catholic Church's certainties on matters of sexuality, masking unsuccessfully in the end a profoundly wounded and wounding dysfunction at the heart of our community. We must acknowledge also that faithful voices inside our traditions are challenging cherished ethical positions. This is not merely because they don't know the tradition and are just blindly following our religion's cultured despises, but because they're attentive to how those positions are doing damage and causing suffering to people already marginalized by society or more generally. They know very well the complex history of ethical thought and scriptural interpretation in our traditions, and so their voices cannot be just dismissed as unfaithful or uninformed. The polarizations evident in our internal ethical debates will have to be resolved by sustained engagement, not just by silencing the challenging voices. Pardon me. we believers often fail to acknowledge or even to recognize that many of those outside our traditions who disagree with long-held Christian or Muslim positions are people of goodwill, and that they have carefully thought through the positions they passionately hold. It could be said that we all, Christian, Muslim, or secular, recognize, mutatis mutandis, something like the Islamic obligation of al-amr bil ma'ruf wa nahy anil munkar. That is to say, we all sense ourselves obliged to urge and promote what is good and to oppose and prevent what we believe to be evil. Our disagreements and conflicts arise firstly from how we're to arrive at an understanding of what is the good to be done, and what is the evil to be avoided. We often differ on what kinds of good can be prescribed or supported by law, and we differ on what kinds of evil need to be proscribed by law. Indeed, the role of law in relation to ethics is a key element we need to face. In our different ways, as believers, we're convinced that the vision of human life and the ethical methods and insights we have inherited or developed are crucial for humanity, a treasure with which we've been entrusted. At the same time, we can scarcely boast of our successes in creating the perfect society, even internally, with all our commands and prohibitions. So this history demands of us great humility before making any claim to ethical certainty. Even if many novel consensuses themselves have little hesitation in claiming authority, no matter how flimsy the analysis and hasty the reflection on which they might be based. So what we'll do in this week, we'll look at three sub-themes. First, how do we use scripture and tradition in our ethical thinking? Secondly, what is the role of reason and experience in ethical thinking, in arriving at an opinion about what is the good to be promoted or the evil to be avoided? And the third subtopic for our consideration is how can we speak and act convincingly in the public square after we have arrived at our ethical insights. That's a tall order, and every Building Bridges tackles something which is a tall order. I should note and welcome someone who was essential, in fact, to bringing Building Bridges to Georgetown and bringing Georgetown to the support of Building Bridges. And that's Professor Jane McAuliffe, who at the time in 2003, when we met in Doha, Qatar, for the second Building Bridges seminar, she came back to Georgetown, I understand, oral tradition has it. She came back to Georgetown and said to Jack DeGioia that this is something that Georgetown ought to support. And Jack, from 2004 until this very day, has been a supporter, even to the point, as Ryan said, from 2012, Georgetown taking full responsibility for the seminar. So thank you, Jane, for to map a bit of the territory that we'll be looking at. I'm going to introduce two scholars to you. The first is Dr. Jonathan Chaplin, who was appointed honorary fellow at Wesley House in Cambridge University in 2022, and who contributes to the work of the Centre for Faith in Public Life. He's been a member of the Divinity Faculty of the University of Cambridge since 2007. He's a political theologian, working on issues of the state, democracy, justice, pluralism, secularism, religious freedom, and environmental theology, And as he said to us at lunch, as he was introducing himself, he said, "If you can think of anything, I'll work on it." From 2006 to 2017, he was first director of the Kirby Lang Institute for Christian Ethics, based in Cambridge University. Our second speaker, Dr. Mahan Mirza, serves as executive director of the Ansari Institute for Global Engagement with Religion at the University of Notre Dame in Indiana, not the University of Notre Dame, that, where are you, Jacob Onyumbe. We have two universities of Notre Dame, one in Congo, one in South Bend, Indiana. Mahan has been with Building Bridges many times. He's an Islamic studies scholar, did his PhD at Yale University, and he's an expert on religious literacy. He brings extensive pedagogical and administrative experience to his role, including serving as Dean of Faculty at Zaytuna College in Berkeley, California, America's first accredited Muslim liberal arts college. Immediately before being appointed to the Ansari Institute, Mahan served as the lead faculty member for Notre Dame's Madrasa Discourses project, which equips Islamic religious leaders in India and Pakistan with the tools to confidently engage with pluralism, modern science, and new philosophies. So I'd like to invite Jonathan and Mahan to come and, yes, why don't you come and join me here.
Thank you very much indeed for that introduction, and thank you so much for the invitation once again. This is my fourth Building Bridges seminar, and I can honestly say these experiences have been among the most stimulating conversations I've had in my scholarly life, indeed in my life. So thank you for the invitation and the privilege of being here, and particularly for inviting me to open this conversation with you today. So I think you will probably quite easily agree with me when I say that this is hardly the most auspicious time to be championing the renewed deployment of religious ethics in the world's public squares. The widespread political abuse of religion in so many contexts is giving the idea of more public religion a terrible name all over again. Authoritarian, populist and nationalist movements increasingly seek to enlist support from religious constituencies whose grievances they think they can exploit for their own tribe's advantages. In widely varying manifestations, this is so in Russia, Brazil, India, Sri Lanka, Israel, the US, the UK, and as the recent European elections confirmed, many other European countries too. The title of American Baptist ethicist David Gushie's 2023 book sums up a challenge that I didn't foresee a generation ago: defending democracy from its Christian enemies. Appeals to religious ethics in such movements looks like just another case of the cynical instrumentalization of religious belief for sectarian political ends. And large portions of religious communities themselves also seem all too willing to be so instrumentalized, whether out of a desire to overcome their marginalization, real or perceived, to protect their threatened cultural identities, to restore their lost hegemony, to keep out foreigners, or just to vanquish the hated other among their compatriots. Obviously, the last thing we want to do is to encourage that kind of religious ethics in the public square. Well, I'm not going to belabor the point to this audience, nor rehearse the many other contemporary political abuses of religious ethics that we witness today around the world. Just to say that the only way to resist these abuses, to state the obvious, is to commit to a long-term project of renewing the wholesome uses of religious ethics, so as to nurture more respectful conversations and cooperation in our deeply riven public squares. As a line in this morning's Anglican cycle of prayer put it, help us to sow good seed in a time of adversity. So I'm going to move straight to constructive mode. How can we encourage the right kind of religious ethics for these public squares? How can we nurture a form of public ethics committed to reasoned deliberation and coalition building, resistant to exploitation, humble about its claims to speak for God, and yet also passionate about justice, while always remaining deeply sourced from the best and most authentic strands of our traditions? It's no small task. Well, a fuller answer than I can give today would need to address a wide range of questions, some of those Dan has just elicited, such as how can we reliably read and interpret the ethical injunctions of our own scriptures and traditions? What is the place of human reason and human experience in those readings? Can we find languages of respectful disagreement in our own communities, yet without tolerating voices that would destroy them from within? How do we determine how to apply our ethics in the radically different contemporary cultural contexts from which our founding texts originated? And another question, and possibly the most difficult, I'm sorry, I missed the line. In the Christian tradition, these are named as questions of exegesis, hermeneutics, epistemology, and contextualization. Another question, perhaps the most difficult, is one of ecclesiology. Who is authorized to decide on all those kinds of questions? But I'm going to set all those questions aside here, and it's easy to do that because I know that Mahan is going to address them all in great detail from his position. So thank you for doing the heavy lifting for us this afternoon. I'm going to ask another question. Assuming we have begun to reach workable answers to those questions, and by the end of next week, of course, they'll all be conclusively resolved. But assuming we have at least workable answers to those questions, how do we then communicate our religiously grounded ethical commitments to audiences outside the religious community? In Christianity, this is a question of missiology, a study of how the church can best convey the truths of the Christian faith in the wider world. And let me say straight away, obviously, that Christian mission is not only about persuading people to accept the Christian faith. It embraces everything said or done pursuant to the complete message of Jesus, to what he called the kingdom of God, that is, the reign of God in this world, and that he claimed to enact in his own life and work, even in his death, and then in his resurrection. For his followers, integral to seeking that kingdom must be working for peace, justice, freedom, solidarity, and compassion in any and every sector of society. In other words, promoting the common good. Or in the words of a Hebrew prophet, much quoted by Christians, seeking the welfare of the city in which you find yourself, for in its welfare is your welfare. So I want to explore the shape of a public Christian ethics that promotes the common good. And given that I've only got about 25 minutes left, I'm going to narrow it down even further to the realm of democratic politics, which is only one sector of society, only one of the many public squares in which the common good is pursued. So my question then is, how can a religiously grounded political ethic be authentically communicated in the contemporary forums of democratic politics? Now, one could approach this question from a wide variety of angles. For 2 generations of Western liberal political theorists, the approach was fed by suspicion, how to police the religious language of citizens so that it did not breach liberal principles of liberty, equality, and neutrality. at least as they understood them. The search was on for accounts of public justification that would prevent religious citizens from imposing their beliefs on others and violating the neutrality of the state. And this issued in various so-called gag rules or doctrines of restraint that told religious believers how they could and could not use religious language in political settings. Well, inevitably that evoked a backlash from many within and beyond Western liberal societies, who argued that such gag rules stifle many citizens' deepest motivations, privatize their core identities, and render them second-class citizens. So, in fact, many liberal theorists today have now modified those strictures and are much more permissive regarding the use of religious language in political debates. And that debate continues, and perhaps surprisingly, not only in Western philosophy departments. But I want to approach the question of the legitimacy of religious ethics in politics with a different question in mind. I'm not going to ask an epistemic question, what kinds of ethical reasoning meet the strictures of neutral public justification, but rather an institutional question, what kinds of ethical reasoning honor the institutional framework of politics? So rather than trying to figure out how to get our justifications straight before entering the public space of politics, let's ask, what are the shape and demands of that public space? And then inquire what kinds of reasoning are called for by it. And I'll refer to this space simply as the polity, using it broadly to mean political institutions and authorities at any level. I want to suggest that our public religious ethics could be better framed if we would take time to identify the unique moral vocation of the institution we call the polity, its specific contribution to human flourishing, the restricted set of tools it has at its disposal, and the limits to its proper jurisdiction. Our talk about political ethics should correspond to the kind of institution to which that talk pertains. When we're speaking to or about the polity, or as an officer of the polity, not just any kind of talk is pertinent or even legitimate. But that's not because it fails to meet some abstract epistemic test of discursive propriety, but because it fails to grasp what kind of a community the polity is and what we can rightly expect of it. Or to use a less flattering term from the book of Revelation, what kind of a beast it is. Well, what is that vocation? So I've suggested that politics is only one of the many arenas through which the common good must be pursued. Most of the Christian tradition has insisted that the scope of the common good, even just the temporal or earthly common good, as distinct from the supernatural common good, is much larger than the mere polity. The polity is only one of many institutions needed to promote the common good. The church, a religious association, the family, and educational, economic, and cultural institutions each make their own distinctive and complementary contributions. And they will bring distinctive ethical languages and insights to public conversation about the common good. Well, my focus is on the political common good, that sphere of action conducive to the common good that falls within the remit of the polity. The political common good is the part of the common good that the polity is uniquely mandated and equipped to advance. Now, talk of the common good, as we all know, can often sound platitudinous. But the political common good concerns very concrete matters of public life. And let me just mention three broad sectors of state activity that it embraces, each of which, incidentally, has drawn the attention of one or other ideological tendency amongst Christians and others. First, the political common good concerns laws or policies that shore up essential micro-social institutions such as marriage, family, neighborhood, school, voluntary association, and so forth. That's been a particular concern of Christians of a conservative persuasion, notably in the US, who've insisted on the vital role of these smaller institutions as cells of moral formation, sources of social cohesion, schools of civic virtue, and so forth. Second, the political common good includes promoting a macro-level infrastructure for public life, legal systems that promote rights, protect rights, and enable or regulate public conduct, transportation, financial, welfare, or communication systems, and so forth. These have elicited much interest from Christians of, in US language, a liberal persuasion. But the political common good is not all about cohesion and coordination. It also involves challenge and confrontation. Thus, third, it includes distributive or social justice, in particular to protect and resource the most vulnerable members of society. And this has been a particular concern of Christians of a radical or liberationist persuasion. And this part of the polity's remit, the pursuit of social justice, is inevitably the most divisive, since it involves naming and dismantling what many Christians call structures of sin, institutionalized forms of injustice that diminish our fellow citizens and trap them in forms of exclusion. So that's one very brief sketch of one Christian account of the nature and vocation of the polity. There are others, but I think that account captures a decent tranche of what a number of contemporary Christian political theologians today would affirm. But whatever specific account we offer, my point is that we need to customize our religious ethics to fit what the polity is normatively suited to do, namely to promote the political common good. This unique institutional vocation quite rightly sets the agenda for that sphere, keeping members on point and warning us against false expectations. So citizens and officials should be guided by this vocation in working out what objectives they may properly pursue, by what means, and through what kinds of argumentation. So for them to seek to mimic the vocations of other institutions will lead to damaging mission drift that will undermine the vocation of the state and that of other institutions. So, for example, to expect the state to be governed according to the norms of the market would be to abdicate the task of promoting the common good. Or to expect the state to elicit the attitudes of awe and deference often experienced in a religious community would be to invite a posture of submission that might be thought suitable for religion, but is deeply dangerous for politics. Many of the quite legitimate ethical concerns that religious believers rightly believe to be essential to a flourishing society under God actually fall outside the scope of the polity, belonging to other institutions or simply to the sphere of personal behavior. So our political talk as citizens should be informed and disciplined by the unique vocation of that institution. But this is not remotely to suggest that citizens have to adopt agendas dictated to them from on high by state officials, or for that matter, by religious authorities. On the contrary, the common good in any sphere is constitutively participatory. So a well-formed polity ought to actively elicit the participation of its members, the critical participation of its members. For example, by conferring on them a suite of rights to vote, rights of speech, association, organizing, opposition, and protest, and so forth. This allows citizens to share in the determination of the content of the political common good, and not only to enjoy its supposed handouts, or worse, impotently suffer its distortions. And this connects to another central theme for our seminar. The political common good can only be identified via processes of reasoned human deliberation and respectful negotiation open to all who are implicated in that common good. And this isn't simply because autocracies make lamentably bad decisions, so do democracies, but because a just political community is bound to respect the human dignity and rationality of all its members. In the Christian tradition, that dignity and rationality are rooted in humankind's status as created in the image of God. And this is the fundamental basis for Christian affirmations of political equality, irrespective of ethnicity, religion, class, gender, national origin, or other differences, and thus for the legitimacy of democracy itself. Now, religious believers, of course, hold that the use of human rationality anywhere, including in the public square, isn't divorced from what they take to be divine revelation. Indeed, they hold that reason is finally subordinate to revelation. And Christians and Muslims offer different accounts of the relationship between the two, some accenting the relative autonomy of reason from revelation, others warning of the fragility of human reason corrupted by sin, and thus placing the priority on revelation, however that is understood. But whatever particular view is taken of the reason-revelation nexus, there's simply no getting away from the brute fact that the demands of revelation, however specific, are never self-implementing. It is always and only human beings who are tasked with interpreting their particular meanings for specific contexts like the polity and then putting them into practice. So merely citing, for example, the sixth commandment, you shall do no murder, could only be the start of the deliberative process by which even a majority Christian polity would need to determine the precise wording of a statute on murder and the appropriate scale of penalties for various breaches of it. Only reasoning, deliberating human beings can do that work. So, I'm arguing then that when we project our religious ethics into the political realm, we should couch our interventions in terms that speak pointedly to the special vocation and limits of the polity. That's my basic thesis. Let me now try and flesh this out in the remaining 10 minutes by suggesting 5 further implications that seem to me to flow from this basic starting point. First, we need to go beyond mere appeals for civility of language and focus on the subject matter of what we are actually talking about within the polity. In response to the divisive toxicity of our current public squares, many voices are rightly urging a restoration of our broken traditions of civility, reasonableness, courtesy, and so forth. A slew of books appearing on that theme in recent years. But an ethic of political civility is not complete unless we know what it is we are to be civil about. We need not just civil discourse, but a discourse about the civil, about the political order itself. Second, while the political common good includes a robust set of protections of religious or conscientious freedom, I think we'd all agree on that, a Christian political ethic should aspire to address a much wider range of public concerns, reflecting the breadth of the demands of the political common good. Democratic engagement should not be seen as simply instrumental to the protection of religious interests, minority or majority, even though, of course, there will be times when those religious interests loom large for some or are simply a matter of survival. Individual citizens or organizations who might be rightly focusing on a limited range of chosen concerns can nevertheless be encouraged to ensure that their particular political passions are not, after all, cases of special pleading, but can find justification within a broader vision. Third, our political ethics need to be framed so as to facilitate consensual decisions wherever possible. As Jürgen Habermas puts it, a secular philosopher who is among the more accommodating of religion in the public realm, as he puts it, the moment we enter the public sphere, we inevitably confront, quote, a pressure for cooperation we cannot escape. In this sphere, he says, there is upon the minds of citizens a pressure to make contributions to a democratic process which is designed to reach, finally, a decision for collectively binding programs. He's surely right, isn't he, that the polity is an arena for the common resolution of shared public problems. It's not an endless debating society. Now, to repudiate that pressure on principle would be to reject a basic norm of citizenship. Indeed, it would be to question the very idea of a political community in which all have an equal stake and where no one can presume to dominate. To accept this point is not, however, to lapse into religious compromise, but rather simply to express solidarity with our fellow citizens whose political destiny, like it or not, we find ourselves sharing. In biblical language, it's one way of seeking the welfare of the whole city in which we find ourselves, rather than either working to take it over ourselves or alternatively trying to carve out an enclave where we can be righteous but alone. Fourth, political institutions are not salvific. Even under high Christendom, political institutions were not seen, at least officially, as authorized to mediate revelation, to dispense grace, or preach the gospel. But at most, were supposed to offer simply external assistance to the church in its religious mission. Although, of course, we know from history that at times that assistance could be pretty deadly. Today, however, most Christian political theologians, with just a few egregious exceptions, reject even that modest role for the state, calling on it to secure generic religious freedoms for all, even where perhaps traces of historical church establishment might still survive, as in England. A Christian political ethics may not seek to bring about conversion or religious conformity, and nor may it legislate presuming that all citizens accept the truth of Christian faith. That, I think, is the element of truth underlying John Rawls's often misunderstood and frankly poorly expressed claim, quote, that politics in a democratic society can never be guided by what we see as the whole truth. That means not that truth claims are banished from political debate, but that we cannot look to the polity to implement our view of ultimate truth across a whole society. But fifth, this restriction, the claim that politics is not salvific, does not imply a polity officially committed to public secularism. It would produce a secular state only in a limited sense. That is, a sense of a state accepting a self-denying ordinance against explicitly endorsing religious justifications for its acts. While citizens and their representatives might have openly advocated such religious justifications in democratic arenas, including legislatures like Congress and Parliament and so forth, in my view, the state would not lend its official imprimatur to those justifications. It would confine itself instead to justifications in terms of the components of the political common good, such as the three I listed earlier. And that's the element of truth that liberal accounts of public justification, I think, are trying to grasp. Note that this restriction is a very narrow one. It only applies to state organs and officials. And that leaves ample room in most forums of democratic deliberation for citizens and their representatives to present deeper ethical or religious justifications for their favored laws or policies, if they judge that appropriate. Often it won't be. And we should not see this as a kind of reluctant concession because, regrettably, we just can't shut the fanatics up. Rather, it's in the interest of the polity itself that it allows such deeper visions to have a democratic airing, so that political deliberation is not confined to purely technical, pragmatic, or consumerist horizons. In one of our seminar readings this week, Rowan Williams urges that we keep the spaces of public deliberation open to the distinctive voices of religious communities, for they can bring, he says, solidarities which exceed and escape the conventional boundaries of public life, but which imbue that public life with depth and moral gravity that cannot be generated simply by the negotiation of practical goods and balanced self-interest. Or as Terry Eagleton puts it, it is only if reason can draw upon resources and energies deeper, more tenacious, and less fragile than itself that it is capable of prevailing. A truth which liberal rationalism, for the most part, disastrously overlooks. In other words, what he's saying is that religion might even be needed to save public reason from itself. Now, let me add here a footnote to Rowan Williams, if I'm allowed to do that. Beyond Williams' specific concern for a deepened public language, religious communities should also be prepared to offer a braver public language, one ready to confront dangerous ideological distortions of the polity, such as secular or religious nationalisms or hubristic progressivisms, or to challenge the structures of sin that oppress citizens and damage the common good. And this is the sense, I think, in which a religious political ethics should also be prophetic and not muted by a rush to premature consensus. The outcome of this will not be official secularism nor official religious establishment, but a polity that protects space for a plurality of convictional voices, some of them religious, and that facilitates constructive debate and negotiation among them, with a view to facilitating focused deliberation on some tangible element of the political common good. So to conclude, I've been suggesting that an appropriate, religiously informed political ethics might proceed by asking not first, or not only, what are the ethical demands of religion, but what are the institutional demands of the polity, and how we might curate our ethical language to honor such an institutional context. And this seems to me to be a strangely neglected question in religious discussions of political ethics, and one that it would be helpful to bring back to the fore of those discussions rather than leaving it lurking undetected beneath them. Now, obviously, what I'm recommending doesn't resolve the multiple substantive disagreements we have about how to bring our faith to bear in public life. It just suggests one way to reframe the conversation. Could be true of the congregation as well. Let's reframe our congregations, please. We'd all like to do that. And of course, in any case, different religious traditions will inevitably offer different answers to the very question of what the polity is. It's not as if there's a prior shared conception of the polity off the shelf already available, leaving us then free to go on to debate what substantive religious ethics we might seek to promote through it. But by keeping that institutional question at the forefront of our minds, we may perhaps open up promising new lines of dialogue, and maybe even stumble into unexpected zones of consensus within and between our religious communities and in wider society. So religion may or may not be a conversation stopper, but asking what the polity is may surprisingly prove to be a fertile conversation starter. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Jonathan. Mahan.
Thanks, Jonathan. That was very interesting. We didn't write our papers in dialogue with each other. We wrote our own papers. So having heard that, I would have probably drafted something different in conversation. But you're going to hear two different streams, and I think you'll see some reasonable amount of overlap and fertility for exchange. For those of you who just walked in, if you're looking for a seat, there's a couple of seats up here in the front, so on both sides. So first, a word of gratitude to Georgetown University and the Berkley Center for hosting these Building Bridges seminars. These seminars were first organized by Reverend Rowan Williams, the Archbishop of Canterbury, after the terror attacks of September the 11th, before they were transferred here to the custodianship of Georgetown. Global crises of the September 11th kind produce different types of responses. Most people are either paralyzed, they simply don't know what to do or how to react, or they build walls of hate with bricks of fear. Some, on the other hand, build bridges of empathy and understanding. We meet now at what seems to be a moment of perpetual and multiple crises. On my shelf are books like Teaching at Twilight. This is one of the titles. Teaching at Twilight, The Meaning of Education in the Age of Collapse. Hospicing Modernity, Facing Humanity's Wrongs and the Implications for Social Activism. Politics of Being, Wisdom and Science for a New Development Paradigm. Homo Deus, A Brief History of Tomorrow. I think I heard an exclamation that I won't repeat. One of these books is written by a Muslim American academic of Pakistani descent, another by a Brazilian scholar in Canada who draws on indigenous wisdom, the third by a French economist who consults for UN agencies, and the fourth by an Israeli historian who centers himself through Buddhist philosophy and meditative practice. Their message is eloquently captured by a short phrase of Pope Francis. We are not living in an era of change, but a change of era. And so, says the Holy Father, step by step, I quote, step by step, we are moving towards catastrophe. Piece by piece, the world risks becoming the theater of a unique third world war. End quote. Too alarmist? Let's turn to a more rational source, say the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres. Quote, like the meteor that wiped out the dinosaurs, he warns, humanity is having an outsized impact on our planet. In the case of the climate crisis, we are not the dinosaurs. We are the meteor. We are not only in danger, we are the danger. End quote. This is the global public square. It is at what President Biden calls an inflection point. Most see a bleak picture. But is this the darkness before a long night or the darkness right before dawn? In the words of the Sikh activist Valerie Kaur, is this the darkness of the tomb or the darkness of the womb? Are we near death or are we about to give birth to something new and beautiful? Robert Bellah argues in his magnum on big history, Religion in Human Evolution, at the turn of every era, breakdowns precede breakthroughs. Pioneers like Elon Musk latch on to this story, hurriedly looking past any impending collapse toward a new and glorious future where we colonize the moons and the planets. Whether or not Musk's dreams come true, we have good reason to believe that the very near future will look nothing like the near or distant past. Presumptions of continuity, a hallmark of traditions, no longer hold. I just leafed through a report titled Situational Awareness on what to expect from AI in the coming years, authored by Leopold Aschenbrenner of OpenAI. It is absolutely shocking. This is what he says. ChatGPT went from version 2 to version 4, basically from preschool to high school intelligence in a matter of a couple of years. By 2027, we will see a similar leap forward. a similar leap from high school, we can expect to have what they call superintelligence by the end of this decade, which will give its possessor, quote, this is what the report says, a decisive military and economic advantage. Enter politics. If we're lucky, argues Aschenbrenner, we'll be in an all-out race with the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party. If we're unlucky, an all-out war. So this is our situation. Both of us began with kind of situational awareness to set the stage on the ethics of our public discourse. Aristotle said that situation gives rise, kairos is the word he uses, gives rise to three forms of rhetoric, which poetically, I would say, don't take this too strictly, connects us to the topic at hand of believers and ethics in the public square. These three forms of rhetoric are related to the past: forensic, the present, epidictic, and future, deliberative. Forensic, to accuse or defend, indict or exonerate, as if in a court of law, perhaps ties to tradition. What was? Epidictic, to praise or to blame, to invite others to feel positively or negatively about something, ties to our modern predicament. What is? Deliberative, to persuade or dissuade on matters of policy, ties to what needs to be done, what should be. The three are joined by narrative. Good narratives hang together. Man is a storytelling animal. Sorry for that. Gendered language is the title of a book. The storytelling animal. What we know, what we knew through philosophy, or have known through philosophy, has now been confirmed through experience. That truth is less about hard empirical facts than it is about worldviews that shape and are shaped by story as much as science. Just look at the pandemic response. Numbers, statistics, empirical facts carry limited persuasive power on their own. They provide meaning when they are storied. This is a parenthesis. I'm not going to develop this, and I'm not being relative, okay, on the truth value of narratives. You can tell supporters of Palestine about the horrors of October 7th. Their minds are elsewhere. Theirs is a story of a century of settlement, occupation, and resistance. You can tell supporters of Israel about the horrors after October 7th. One might say before and after. Their concerns are existential. Theirs is a story of near annihilation, a story that centers their struggle to survive against all odds. Knowledge acquired through academic disciplines and fields of study is also like a story. The story of the birth and evolution of the universe is cosmology. Its source is light from the distant past that we capture through telescopes. The story of the fundamental forces of nature is physics. The story of atoms and molecules is chemistry. The story of life is biology. And the story of the movement of culture through time is history. That's how Harari, mention him once more, sets up his book, Sapiens. I find the framing compelling. The substance I will leave to a debate at Early. If you study the history and philosophy of science, you know that Aristotle's story of physics is different from Newton's and Einstein's. Like philosophers and scientists, believers, even in the same God and prophet, live in different thought worlds, different story worlds. Our ethics in the public square are guided by different kinds of stories, connected to different kinds of knowledge projects and different kinds of faith projects. So now let me offer three kinds of stories, each associated with a particular type of reasoning in the public square. This is only illustrative, okay? Not absolute, neither perfectly categorical. There's room to play with this. It's only illustrative. Story one. God has spoken to prophets since the dawn of history, beginning with Adam, the first man, his special creation. God's words have meaning. These meanings can be known through reason and through transmission from generation to generation. Though scholars can reasonably disagree on some of what God has commanded, there are certain commands known by necessity. Ma'lum min ad-din bid-darura. Individual believers may not exercise discretion in such matters. They must listen and obey. That is Islam, submission. And it is known to qualified scholars by consensus. So that's one story. This is the story of a document published last year called Navigating Differences, Clarifying Sexual and Gender Ethics in Islam, signed by over 200 male Muslim scholars and believing academics from North America, plus 5 women. I hope I counted right, it's just my count. So, the document draws on the principle of religious freedom in order to safeguard traditional norms of gender and sexuality. Social pressures, it argues, are driving believers to accept LGBTQ-centric values. Those who wish to preserve so-called traditional values must either remain silent or risk being called bigots. This is unacceptable. Because of public policies in schools, parents are finding it difficult, argues the document, to protect their children. There is, quote, an atmosphere of intolerance toward faith communities. We are Muslim, this is how the statement begins. We are Muslim scholars and preachers representing a diverse range of theological schools. Below, commences the statement, is our collective non-partisan articulation of Islam's position on sexual and gender ethics. That's how the document begins. So I'm not going to go over the document, but I'm encourage you to read it. Navigating Differences was excoriated by other Muslims with a different story about what Islam is and what it ought to be. Story 2. God spoke to his final prophet in 7th century Arabia. The prophet, and through him his companions, knew what God meant. But there is no way for us to know what God truly means when we read Scripture today. The historical tradition, curated by males, consists of patriarchal meanings projected onto the text, inflected by the mores of past ages and cultures. True religion is lived religion, what believers practice on the ground. Attempts to prescribe norms through text and tradition are attempts to maintain power and authority in the hands of a small group of mostly male elites. They are, in fact, acts of cultural violence. So this is story 2. This is a story of someone like Professor Suad Abdul Khabir, at least reading her annotated response to Navigating Differences that she posted on X, formerly Twitter. Among the many important glosses worthy of mention, none gets to the core more than the addition of the words, our opinion on. So she's annotating the document. So she adds the words, our opinion on, before the words, Islam's position on sexuality and gender. Abdul Khabir systematically dissects the document, arguing that it represents selective outrage around sin. Why pick on this issue rather than the structural violence of racism or the very real threats to the entire human species through war and climate change, for example, for such a collective statement? Isn't it naive to focus on gender and sexuality, she asks, because it forges an alliance with the same right-wing anti-LGBTQ elements responsible for the anti-Muslim and anti-Sharia hysteria we experience in political discourse all around us. What kind of alliance are you making here? And this is how their closing comment, I think, really gets to the heart of story 2. I quote, she says, I have witnessed the sincerity of queer Muslims who demonstrate a love for Allah and Allah's Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and family, alayhi salam, that is unwavering, the kind of faith Allah describes lovingly when Allah describes the best of believers. That's how she ends. So true Islam, as I read it, as she's arguing, is an Islam faithfully practiced in real life, not necessarily an Islam that's dogmatically prescribed from the text. Story 1 and story 2 can be contrasted with two competing approaches to the study of Islam. The former representing the art of text study, a core method for traditional theology and normative madrasa studies, and what we employ in building bridges. The latter representing the art of anthropological or religious studies, which favors direct observation of people and practices rather than an exploration of texts. Consider, for example, contemporary definitions of religion, such as the first part of a particularly long definition offered by sociologist Christian Smith in his book Religion, What It Is, How It Works, and Why It Matters. Quote, "Religion is a complex of culturally prescribed practices." That's how he begins. Or this pithy definition offered by Scott Appleby in The Ambivalence of the Sacred, religion is the human response to a reality perceived as sacred. It's the cultural practices, the human responses that are centered. To be sure, texts are not excluded. They represent a form of human response. This is I'm speaking about in the empirical lived community study of religion. But whether or not they are universally prescriptive, and if so, how so, depends on your story. Story 1 and story 2 are deeply polarizing. They are two incommensurable paradigms, like the cosmoi of Aristotle and Einstein, whose worlds consist of different elements and forces. Even the same word means two completely different things in differently conceptualized universes. Gravity refers to the natural motion of objects toward or away from the center in one universe, and to the curvature in space around mass in another universe. An epic illustration of the clash of the two stories is the public conversation prompted by Aisha Chaudhry's intervention on the need for what she calls intersectional Islamic studies, IIS, as opposed to white supremacist Islamic studies, WISIS, or patriarchal Islamic legal studies, PILS. In her essay published in the Oxford Handbook of Islamic Law, 2018, Chaudhry argues that the study of Islam in Western academia is a colonial project dominated by white and or brown male scholars who privilege text over lived realities. It's a critique of story 1. In story 2, which I feel she adheres to much more closely, quote, "The myth of objectivity is busted," end quote. So we're all situated, and as Chaudhry argues, again there's a quote, "There is no plain sense or literal meaning of the text, because this meaning is always created by people reading and speaking for the text," end quote. In effect, as pointed out by Ahmed Ash-Shamsi in his response to Chaudhry, one of many responses that appeared, story 2 collapses the distinction between prescriptive and descriptive. Ash-Shamsi titles his rebuttal, "How Not to Reform Islamic Law." But for Chaudhry, a blurring of the line between prescriptive and descriptive is not a problem. In fact, it's the whole point. Prescriptions, after all, are nothing more than power plays. Predictably, as I see the exchange, now you might disagree and we'll have a conversation, that the interlocutors talk past each other. Just like Aristotle and Einstein would talk past each other, if instead of seeing the world as the other would have them see it, they could only see their own. So here we are with two different incommensurable story worlds contending for authority and legitimacy in the public square. Enter story 3, a hybrid story. God's words have meanings that are knowable to us across time and place. Why else would he speak? His words were understood perfectly by the prophet, well enough by his companions, and perhaps less so by subsequent generations. We must nonetheless strive to access these meanings to the best of our ability, whether through transmission or empirical study or through the prism of our own experiences, by applying our best synthetic reasoning in every domain, and then prudently translate these meanings into commandments on how to live. Moves of interpretation and translation will vary from mind to mind, person to person, culture to culture, and age to age. We may or may not get it right, but text and tradition nonetheless carry authoritative prescriptions. When some of these prescriptions conflict with today's moral sensibilities, it is probably best to temporarily suspend our own judgment or just say no to the text outright. And God knows best. Two examples to illustrate story 3 are Amina Wadud and Tariq Ramadan. In Quran and Woman, rereading the sacred text from a woman's perspective, Wadud follows this third story. She says, my objective in undertaking this research was to make a reading of the Quran that would be meaningful to women living in the modern era. Each reading, she argues, consists of a complex interplay between the text representing authorial intent, a prior text representing the subjectivity of the reader, and the cultural and historical context within which the reader is situated. As such, each reading is contingent, knowable and true, yet enigmatic and shifting from place to place, person to person. Wadud's second book, Inside the Gender Jihad, pushes to the farthest limit ethical tensions between text, the inflexibility of a male-dominated interpretive tradition, and contemporary norms of gender justice. It moves from theology of text to a social movement for change, to have women's full dignity recognized in everyday communal life. Wadud's approach is to work through the first principle of Tawheed, the oneness of God, in order to reconstruct a more gender egalitarian worldview, which is more in line with the Quran, a text that she argues is not fixed, but a text in process through this acts of interpretation. As such, she proposes that with the movement of culture, believers encounter the possibility of refuting that quote, I'm quoting here, possibility of refuting the text to talk back, to say no. End quote. Some have interpreted this stance as one of feminist intransigence, where a female rebel is refusing to submit, not just to her husband, but to God himself. I think that this critique of Wadud is uncharitable, if not wrong-headed. As Jonathan Brown points out in Misquoting Muhammad, the male-centered tradition has always found ways to say no to the text. In a chapter titled, When Scripture Can't Be True, he writes, he's engaging Wadud here, so if one takes Sharia courts as the primary interpreters of God's law, then they repeatedly said no to the evident meaning of the Quranic verse. The verse in question here is the notorious 434, which according to its apparently straightforward meaning, permits men to strike, interpreted variously, strike, daraba, their wives. Yet, argues Brown in alignment with Wadud, quote, I'm quoting Brown, no matter how immediate God's command or how obvious any act of speech might seem, we cannot process their meanings without acts of interpretation. There is no such thing as literal meaning, he says, in its usual sense of what a text really says. Nonetheless, for Brown, interpretive efforts yield positive results through the work of well-intentioned and learned interpretive communities. For Wadud, such communities are suspect when they are not diverse, and they are not, because they're almost universally comprised of males. So bracketing this difference between Wadud and Brown, of whether it's interpretive communities that yield meaning or whether it's one's individual effort, as she does when she struggles with the text. Wadud and Brown, and I don't want to minimize the importance of that distinction between the two. Wadud and Brown appear to me to be more or less aligned, that interpretation takes place in situ, that there are legitimate ways to say no to the text, that culture is an important factor, perhaps a defining factor, and that the line between word and meaning is never linear. To be clear, Wadud does not deny the possibility or reality, at least I didn't see this, of prescriptive meanings other than her own. She's merely asserting her right to speak from where she stands. Another way to say no to the text, this is my last example, is offered by Tariq Ramadan, and he's included in our text for discussion. When good faith attempts at meaning-making through interpretive communities yields no good result, he argues, it is best to temporarily suspend judgment rather than offer unjust prescriptions. You see the similarity. In reference to the hudud laws of the Sharia that involve corporal punishment, Ramadan writes, I'm quoting here, one can see that the opinions on this subject are so divergent and entrenched that it becomes difficult to discern what the respective arguments are. That's his quote. Therefore, he calls for, again I'm quoting, an immediate international moratorium on corporal punishment, stoning and the death penalty in all Muslim majority countries. And quote there, pending further research that can provide interpretive clarity. All right, and this undertaking, I'm just going to summarize so I move on, requires wide-ranging collaboration between scholars and intellectuals in different spheres. And this is because, and I quote here at the end, since the matter is not only about a relationship to the text, but equally to the context. This is Ramadan. So the hybridity is apparent. There are meanings, but times change. Moral sensibilities are tied to social context. The parallel with Brown here is clear. The interpretive community is affirmed, but is now global and has multiple specializations, must be reconstituted as such. The parallel with Wadud is unmistakable. To some things, we just have to say no. In one case, one says no to the text when corporal punishments are out of sync with the times. In the other case, one says no when it's patriarchy that no longer holds sway. Our embodied subjectivities and social locations guide our concerns and moral sensitivities. This is why Keisha Ali demands that we cite more female scholars, and why Sherman Jackson centers the Black American knowledge and experiences. Ramadan's context is the hyper-secular France. He's under pressure to explain his fealty to Islam in the context of an emerging European rights consensus that anathematizes the death penalty and corporal punishment as counter to human dignity. So how are these various perspectives to be constructively engaged? Is there a way to bring incommensurable story worlds into dialogue? What should be our ethics in the public square, and wherein lies the truth? Am I out of time? Or can I finish this?
A couple of minutes, yeah.
Okay. There are multiple theories of truth in a couple of minutes. So I'm just going to skip over this. Correspondence, coherence, and pragmatic, like things work. And so if you look at the classical tradition, they focus more on correspondence as where truth lies. That al-ilm ma yutabiq al-waqi', like it's in, your knowledge must correspond to reality. And now the ground has shifted under us so much that correspondence is very difficult. So I argue here that instead we should perhaps look more towards coherence and beauty and see what works. And in order to do that, we have to be aware of our situation, the present moment, and the compelling ethical questions that are driving not just our, the local conversations, but the global public conversation. So there's allusions to there. Anwar Shah Kashmiri, who does something very, very interesting in shifting of perspectives, and he's a Deobandi scholar. So I'm just going to read the last section of this and then conclude. So the Pakistani Quran scholar Israr Ahmed said, I studied with him and I value his contributions tremendously, but he said that if the Quran were revealed today, or if it were revealed in another place, it would have said the same things in a different language or in a different way. But we must ask, would it have said the same things? Might the Quran have instead drawn our attention to the earth's rotation about its axis as it orbits the sun? So above I have the example of how the perspective shifts in cosmologies. So would the Quran have addressed this shifted perspective, inviting us to marvel at how we sway not with its motion, the motion of the earth? Would today's Quran have asked us to consider how God created us, male and female, and some neither, along a spectrum between the two? Would the Quran have pointed to the evolution of life forms, one from another, all related to each other and to the cosmos through stardust. So these are a bit provocative, but I think fruitful for discussion. So let me wrap this up. Halak, he talks about this epistemic havoc wrought by modernity. And people like, Pope Francis, before him, William Butler Yeats, and so many others have talked about how things are falling apart and the center cannot hold. And so I wanted to conclude by offering 5 principles to help us navigate in the public square for believers. And maybe they can just read the paper and we move to discussion. Or should I offer these 5 principles? 2 minutes? Okay. So 1, on the issue of truth, think of coherence instead of correspondence. The world of interpretation is riddled with positionality and subjectivity across time and place. Interpretation is mediated by layers of stated and unstated assumptions. The cosmos of the past, with stable elements in natural places, with truths that are knowable, if properly conceptualized and argued, is not the cosmos of the present, with quarks and all kinds of forces, curved space and variable time, evolution and quantum flux, where knowledge is fallible and contingent. One of the definitions of knowledge found in classical texts of theology is al-ilm ma yutabiq al-waqi', which I already summarized. So we move from that into a different mode of thinking about truth. 2, given that knowledge is situated, I draw on Donna Haraway here, her essay on situated knowledges, because we want to avoid the trap of relativism. And so I'm not saying that there's no such thing as reality, or that the truth is not knowable, or people can't have convictions. What I am saying is that our ability to know is limited and provisional. And so there's a call for humility here. It's always an approximation. And the source of ijma', more expansively understood as a relative consensus of specialists in different domains of study, I think it still has value to guide us. That when specialists agree, right, in different domains of study, we should look carefully. There's a reality there to be reckoned with. Number 3, when an interpretation appears abhorrent instead of beautiful, or just seems out of step, right? I'm not saying be cowards and don't affirm your faith, but just don't also stop with God has spoken. And you just got to take it. Consider suspending judgment, bracketing your own understanding, and resume the search for better answers. Also, when you disapprove of the position of others, it is fair and good to voice disagreement. We have to have constructive exchange, offer alternatives, but be cautious and withhold absolute ultimate judgment. And this practice of irja, like the suspension of judgment, withholding it in the face of doctrinal multiplicity and incoherence, is among the earliest of theological positions in Islam, sometimes characterized as a proto-Sunni position. 4, you shall know them by their fruits. Focus on good outcomes. As the Quran says, vie with each other in the doing of good works. And in the study Quran, there's a beautiful elaboration of how this verse is really one of the nuggets that shines light on a pluralistic worldview within Revelation. And lastly, remember that we live in different story worlds. You can believe your story, love your story, but you should allow yourself to also read other stories. What else could the Quran mean when it asks us to get to know one another? The Quran, I believe, is inviting us to journey, to glimpse other worlds. And remember the saying of Imam Shafi'i, which I close with, this is also in our text pack. I never debated with anyone, but that I did not mind whether Allah clarified the truth on my tongue or on His tongue. For that, we need to be listeners and risk takers, open to self-transformation, even as we hope to win over others to our side. And as we travel, we must bear in mind that different story worlds also have the same God. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, and praise be to God, the Lord of the worlds. Thank you.
Thank you, Mahan. Thank you, Jonathan. Among you are the members of the seminar, and we've told them that they don't get to speak at the moment because we want to give an opportunity for those of you who've come to join this session to ask questions, to perhaps make a brief observation. And I think in the 15 or so minutes we have opened the floor to these two scholars who've so richly opened the questions for us, and you'll see that the 4 days we have left of this seminar is not going to be nearly enough to, we'll be left wanting more, which is always good. So, the floor is open.
I'm going to ask an old-timer's question, but one of the things, and I think, Dan, in your beginning remarks, you said that the third section of the conversation at the seminar will be on the broader implications and disseminations. One of the criticisms that's often been made of building bridges or any other long-standing Christian-Muslim study and dialogue efforts is it's wonderful for the participants, it's deeply enriching for those who have an opportunity to be informed and engaged in an effort like this. But where does it go from here? I know I'm sitting next to Lucinda, who does a fabulous job with the books from each seminar, but we're so desperately in need of this kind of discourse and the ability to have it. Where do your thoughts go, Mahan and Jonathan, on the dissemination, the much broader dissemination of the insights that you will undoubtedly share this week?
You know, that's a tough question. I think at its core, for me, it's the self-transformation that I kind of ended with. My first seminar here was the monotheism seminar. And I had never just engaged Trinitarian conceptions the way that we did here. And I feel like I got it. And it really, it's a different conception of monotheism. It's not the same, but it's monotheism. And I found myself having this conversation many times, around the table with Muslim friends and colleagues. Like, no, this one, like, no, what the Quran says. I said, the Quran says this, that's, Quran's construction. And here's how Christians construct their thought. So there's two different ways to construct it and keep them in their place. And so what I'm trying to say by that is the self-transformation is not, I think, insignificant. And if they can travel through the world and do good things through our movement, in addition to the publications, that's a great achievement. Many times we have just fleeting, shallow encounters, and this is much deeper.
So thank you. The toughest question right at the beginning. So let's just get that one out of the way quickly and then move on. I think my thought immediately goes to just the scale and complexity of the educational and the formative task that our religious communities face. So you pick I'm guessing, you pick pretty much any religious community, whether Christian or Muslim or anything else. Ask yourself, what is the level of awareness and preparation for engaging in ethical reasoning? And then, what is the level of preparation and ability for communicating those ethical insights into wider public spheres? It's pretty limited in my experience, at least that's my experience of Christian communities, for all sorts of reasons. So we have to empower our religious community to be better formers of our members as ethical thinkers and ethical negotiators, and then public communicators. And my impression is that that is far too low on the agenda of many religious communities, certainly Christian communities, even those that have all these rich traditions behind them of Christian social thought. It barely makes much of a presence felt in your typical congregation. So there's a huge task there, and I think one of the key challenges is not just generic theological formation, but ministerial formation or priestly formation. How do we form the pastors and the priests and the ministers who will then equip the congregations? And there's a huge lacuna there, I think. But in addition, what you find, partly as a result of that limitation, is that you get all kinds of other freelance organizations springing up, which is great. You know, let 1,000 flowers bloom. I could list a dozen off the top of my head that operate in the UK that are attempting to sort of compensate for that deficit of educational formation in your typical congregation. So we need to strengthen them and, you know, let them multiply. And, we can just do what we can over a generation or two. It's extremely difficult now because of all the cross pressures that we've just heard about, but it's those grassroots educational initiatives, I think, that are going to make a difference.
Pardon my lack of intelligence. After listening to the two presentation, I couldn't find the two meld together. Is it like a Baltimore Bridge? Or do you see some shoots of reconstruction, Mr. Biden style?
Baltimore Bridge, that's the one that collapsed, right? Yeah, okay, yeah, that did make it across to the headlines. Let me give my account. I mean, so Mahan addressed, you know, that first series of questions. How do you engage with the text, sacred texts? How do you interpret those texts? How do you contextualize those interpretations for a different... So you were primarily concerned with how a community engages with its own authorities, its own religious authorities, in particularly texts. My point picked up, well, I was first, but I was hoping you were going to go first, actually. Then I could say, well, he's dealt with all those questions, and I'm going to talk about this, which is once you've reached some sort of clarity on what ethical stances you want to promote, you know, what makes for a good society, what makes for a good family policy, what makes for a good educational system, what makes for a good transport system, those concrete public questions. Once you've done some thinking about that in the religious community, how do you then translate that and communicate it into the wider public? So I think they were perfectly complementary, don't you?
Yeah.
So that's not being facetious, but they were attempting to pick up at different points in the spectrum of questions that we've faced ourselves. That's right. Yeah. Is that about right?
I think that's about right. I mean, there's a range of complexity, right, in how we arrive at our ethical positions and how we just engage them amongst ourselves and with each other. But then there's also a question of how to prioritize what to bring to the fore. And I think your presentation was thinking more along those lines, and how should our thinking be about the nature of institutions that also helps us think about, well, what is it that we promote in the different kind of spheres of society? And so there's some complementarity there. They dovetail, but I think we have to do some work to think about exactly how the stitches come together.
But every one of the questions that you raised in relation to your tradition
Yeah.
are replicated almost identically in the Christian tradition. You know, Christians out there are nodding vigorously. We all recognize exactly those same tensions on a daily basis, and we don't have solutions to them either. You know, I mean, we're all in the same boat in that respect, groping for ways of dealing with that same agenda of questions.
Yes, I think perhaps the title of the seminar, Building Bridges, suggests that there's a fundamental gap between us, and that we need to bridge that gap. But the experience of these 21 years that I've been involved in it is precisely as Jonathan and Mahan just said. We are both facing similar issues, and we learn from one another to face those issues together, to face those issues in slightly different ways. This is not, we don't come together to resolve our differences. Exactly. Rowan Williams used to often say that at building bridges, what we do is we don't seek agreement, we seek to improve the quality of our disagreements. There are things we will disagree on, and we ought to disagree on. But our disagreements will be based on a real knowledge of the other tradition and precisely how the other tradition functions in what I tend to call the theological kitchen. We often speak to one another with creedal statements, or this is what Islam says, this is what Christianity says. We give the bottom line, but when you actually see scholars, Muslim scholars arguing amongst themselves and grappling with texts, you see Christian scholars from different traditions arguing theologically, approaching text differently. It gives you new insight into precisely how the traditions function, and so any disagreements they're much better disagreements because they're based on real knowledge, not just slogans or one-liners. Yes, please.
Thank you. Part of my question is really, it seemed like in both of your presentations, this tension between the individual choice of how we interpret text and how we make decisions for the ethics of our own lives, but then also our collective choices. And even in, Jonathan, in your presentation, talking about the difference between conservative and liberal conceptions of the polity and how the conservatives tend to focus on the family and liberals in your text focusing more on the social and common good or policy issues. How do we, in my interpretation, they're both necessary for each other. And so how are we finding the space between those two? Like, how are we finding movement for those two, and how are we reconciling that tension? How are you doing so?
Well, so the reason I identified those three parts of what I call the political common good as the enthusiasms of one of the three main political tendencies is precisely to challenge each of those tendencies to broaden their own vision. So, these, whether you're a conservative, a liberal, or a radical, simplistic terms perhaps, take in a larger perspective of what the common good is. And typically what happens is that, in the Christian tradition at least, Christians who focus exclusively on let's say individual freedom or the market or very small institutions have kind of exaggerated the relative significance of that cluster of social questions as compared to the needs of society as a whole, or the demands of the common good as a whole. So there are kind of ideological narrowings going on all the time, with just one other particular component of the common good being seized upon. But I do want to affirm that all of them are part of the common good. So we've got to get beyond this polarization and have conversations that allow each of those wings, so to speak, with those different enthusiasms to present their concerns as bona fide elements of the common good, which I think they are, but then also to hear the perspectives of other political standpoints, which they have overlooked. That's the goal. So that's a sort of political ecumenism taking place within a larger Christian ecumenism, and beyond that, interfaith ecumenism. So it's a complex, multi-layered debate, but it's that bigger integrative vision, I think, that we have to try to work towards. And right now, of course, all the tides are against it. Polarization, tribalization, balkanization is dividing our political mind and fracturing our political communities. And we just have to take every opportunity that exists to resist that.
I think that that brings us towards the end of our time, at least our formal time here. But I'll hand the word to Ryann to thank our speakers and to invite you.
I will just offer a quick word of thanks to Dan, Jonathan, and Mahan. Thank you so much for your thoughtful contributions, your conversation, your provocations, and for opening the way for the seminar to engage with ethics in the public square. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon. On behalf of the Georgetown University President's Office and the Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs, our event co-sponsors, we would like to invite you to a reception just out the back door into the President's room. Thank you so much. Please offer a round of applause for our speakers today.